So let's get some insight into tax reform, the budget, and the U.S. economy. White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney joins us tonight from the North Lawn. Mr. Director, thanks for being with us. First on hurricane relief funding. Obviously, you've already gotten across the finish line the first down payment on Harvey funding. You're looking at a big ticket here. Do you know how much?
Oh, no, and we won't know for quite some time. That's why we've sort of broken it up into smaller pieces. The amount of money we asked for last week that Congress gave us on a bipartisan basis was enough to get us through probably at least the middle of October. Of course, these numbers can change depending upon how substantial the damage was in Florida. A lot of this is still guesswork. It's early on. But we provided enough money to sort of buy us some time to start to learn about the damage in Texas, learn about the damage in Florida. But it could be months before the totals are in. We'll deal with this in sort of a as-we-go basis, just to make sure, number one, the first things are first. We're taking care of the people who need it immediately right now in Florida, folks who are still underwater in Texas, and deal with those larger issues of rebuilding those two states a little bit later on. So first things first, and I think that's the way we've moved through it for the last couple of weeks.
Understanding that Democrats and Republicans are talking about, fully supporting the people in need, does this change your calculations as you're doing the math for the budget?
No, everyone wants to help the folks who need. There's no question about that, and that's why it was so nice to have their support, the Democrat support last week on the package. So no, whether or not there'll be Democrat support doesn't change the number. We're going at the numbers based upon what the damage is and what folks need in those two damaged areas.
There was also talk in that meeting between the president and Senator Schumer that there was some kind of gentleman's agreement that perhaps the debt ceiling would be no longer. Where is the White House on that?
I was in that conversation. The president and I have talked about that a couple times since then. I think this is what's driving the president's frustration. He's a businessman, and he sees that all too often, perhaps, the debt ceiling gets so politicized, it becomes so divisive that it prevents the effective management of the government. Keep in mind, he is still the chief executive of the country and charged with running the country. So when he sees the debt ceiling used as it has been in the recent past, that's extraordinarily frustrating for him, and he's asked me to explore ways to sort of depoliticize it. We'll continue to work on that. I don't think the debt ceiling, again, Brett, will be an issue until probably January, February of next year, so we get some time to work on that.
Right, but Republicans believe it's a check on the debt, which now stands at more than $20 trillion tonight.
It is, and there's a check and balance both ways. A debt ceiling not only has to be approved by Congress, it has to be signed by the president. So it's part of the check and balance system. Like I said, we'll go through and see if there's a way we can sort of lower the politicization of the debt ceiling a little bit between now and February.
Is 15% business tax cut, corporate tax rate, realistic?
Hope so. It's what we've been pushing for from the very beginning. Keep in mind, we went from having the lowest corporate tax rate in the world to now the highest. So the president is still very much committed to trying to get that 15%. That said, at the end of the day, we'll take the very best tax package we can that can actually pass. The president doesn't get to wave a magic wand and do everything that he wants. We've learned that several times over already at the beginning of the administration. So what we're hoping for is that we can get as close to that 15% as we can, because the closer we get to the 15%, the better the impact on the economy, the more growth, the more opportunity, the more jobs, and that's what's driving all of this.
Obviously, the president's reaching out to Democrats, trying to get votes on the tax reform package. One would assume, many Democrats from red states, that he won. Do you think that it will be revenue neutral? In other words, do you think that you can form something that will not raise the deficit, the debt, and considering that you have a budget that assumes 3.5% to 4.5% growth, there's a lot of people that look at that and say that's overly optimistic.
Actually, the budget that we wrote assumes a 3% growth, not 3.5% or 4%. But as to your point about whether or not it will be revenue neutral, I hope not. We need as big and as a dramatic tax reduction and tax reform as we possibly can get. And I think if we look at this through that static model and say, well, we're going to have to raise money over here to make up for taxes foregone over there, we will never get the size of the tax reductions and tax reforms that we need. What's driving all of this, Brett, and you and I have talked before about the concept of Maganomics, about getting to sustained 3% growth, is figuring out a way to unleash the American economy again. And we think that a revenue neutral neutral, sort of a fiddling along the edges on the margins of the tax bill is not the way to do that.
Yeah, right. The budget is 3% this year, but economic growth is projected at 1.8% over the decade. Would you concede that whatever tax reform package comes forward, that you'll agree that the CBO will be the marker that scores it, the Congressional Budget Office?
No, in fact, I absolutely disagree with the CBO. That number that you referenced, that 1.8 forever on the economic growth forecast, that is the CBO model. We absolutely dismiss that. That's the Obama new normal. That's the Obama era. We'll never get to 3% again, and we absolutely and wholeheartedly reject that.
Well, they say a declining, aging population is affecting the job growth and productivity. So how do you change that?
Welfare reform gets people back to work. Keep in mind, yes, we are in an aging population, but the workforce participation rate is below where it should be, even after you consider the baby boomers who are retiring. So there are people who are dropping out of the job market for reasons other than their age. We need them to come back to work. That was a big part of our budget. When you talk about productivity, another factor in GDP growth, one of the things that our tax bill is aimed at is at spurring capital investment. The amount of capital per worker has been basically flat for the last 10 years in this country. We need to have businesses invest more capital, machines, computers, etc., per employee to get those folks' productivity and GDP growth up. So no, this is exactly what this tax bill is aimed at, getting back to 3% or higher and rejecting that 1.8 forever of the previous administration.
You know where the lines are drawn up on Capitol Hill. You have people in the Republican Party who were like you used to be, Congressman Mulvaney, very concerned about the deficit and debt. You have, on the Democratic side, a different mentality about where they're thinking about growth. As you look at this, is there a possibility of walking through the middle there somehow? Is there a big deal in the making? Maybe Simpson Bowles-esque, that is kind of a big deal that gets everybody on the same page?
I haven't heard much talk about that at this point. We're focusing on the tax reform bill that we're going to be I hope that I think might actually come out. Your introduction mentioned it might be later this month. I think you might see more details on it this week. I know the president keeps pushing Congress to go faster. He's frustrated at how slow it's been going, and he's pushing them just today to try and get the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee and the Senate to go faster. So I think that's where you're going to see all of our attention. It's part of the reason that he struck that deal last week on the debt ceiling and the CR to sort of clear the decks. It's tax reform, tax reform, tax reform, because that's what's going to save the country.
This year.
Oh, this year, and retroactive this year, I hope.
Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, thanks for the time.
Thanks, Brett.